Today in Avatar Spoilers, we get the biggest budded creature in all of Magic, a couple of sweet lands, our exclusive MTGGoldfish preview, and so much more, so let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Avatar spoilers. So we're creeping towards the end of Avatar spoiler season. We should have the full set on Friday, so only a couple days to go, but today we still have a ton to talk about. It's some really powerful stuff, which means we better jump right into it, start talking sweet new Avatar cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Avatar. First up today, we get one of the funniest and most interesting and one of my personal favorite cards from the entire set in the Walls of Ba Sing Se. So Walls of Ba Sing Se, it is a new 8-mana mythic artifact creature wall. It has defender, so not going to be doing any attacking unless you have some shenanigans that we'll talk about in a minute. It says other permanents you control have indestructible, and then it's a 0/30, which means the Wall of Ba Sing Se is the new biggest budded creature in all of Magic. Before walls came along, Ancient Animatios had the most toughness as a 8/20. Came out in Final Fantasy. The Walls of Ba Sing Se has it beat by a full 10 toughness. So if you're just someone who likes big butts and you cannot lie, this is the card for you. As far as what the card does, it's basically a bad Avacyn Angel of Hope. It's an Avacyn Angel of Hope, an 8-drop that gives everything indestructible. But the problem with Walls of Ba Sing Se is it doesn't make it self-indestructible. So your opponent can't always just kill the walls and then kill everyone hiding inside the walls, perhaps with a giant drill that looks sort of like a Soul Shaker. But it's still an interesting card. It is some protection for your board, and if you want to do a bit of work, you can build this into a real Avacyn if you make it indestructible with like a Darksteel Plate or a Mithril Coat, or even putting a Lightning Greaves or a Swiftfoot Boots on it to give it Shroud or Hexproof. It's pretty good protection, so it's kind of Avacyn with extra steps, but with the upside that it's colorless, so you can play it in basically any deck that you want to. So I will say, the Walls of Ba Sing Se is not a card that I think you play fairly. Like, it's hard for me to imagine that you just ramp up to 8 mana and cast a 0/30 that kind of protects your board but doesn't protect itself. But what makes this card exciting is the fact that it has such ridiculously high toughness and such low power, which opens up a bunch of weird synergies and shenanigans. So what do we actually do with this card? Well, first, there's some cards that reanimate things with low power. Like, for example, in Standard right now, we have Smile at Death. With the beginning of your upkeep, you get to reanimate 2 creatures with power 2 or less. So this can reanimate the Walls of Ba Sing Se. In older formats, we have Vesperlark. You can evoke it for 2 mana, and when it dies, reanimate something with power 1 or less. So this can reanimate the Walls of Ba Sing Se as early as turn 2. Or in Commander, maybe you have Alicia who Smiles at Death, which can reanimate creatures with power 2 or less when it attacks. Or maybe you're playing Nethroi, which can return creatures of total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield when it mutates. So in a deck with Nethroi, it's kind of just a free Nethroi target since it has 0 power. So you're essentially just reanimating an 8-drop for free. It doesn't count towards your Nethroi cards. So I think that's synergy number 1, taking advantage of the fact that the card has 0 power. There's also some cards that just care about high toughness, and we do have some of these in Standard. I'm not sure this is going to be a super realistic deck, but it'll probably be a funny against the odds deck. Like, for example, Walking Bulwark. For 1 mana, you get a defender that lets you pay 2 and gives target creature with defender haste and allows it to attack as though it didn't have defender, and it assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So essentially, you get on walls, you Walking Bulwark it, you attack with a 30/30. We also have the Pride of the Whole Clad, which you pay 4 mana until end of turn. Target creature you control gets +1/+0. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw cards equal to its toughness, and it can attack as though it didn't have defender. So essentially, if you hit with a Walls of Ba Sing Se after activating Pride of Holclad, you get to draw 30 cards. 30 cards, which is insane. It also almost turns on Baitor all by itself. Baitor's final mode cares about 40 total toughness on the battlefield. If you have Baitor and Wall, that's 37, so you just need 3 extra toughness, and you get all the modes on Baitor. Once you get back to Commander, there's even more synergies. There's several commanders that specifically care about high toughness creatures or high toughness creatures with defender. Like Doran the Siege Tower lets all your stuff deal damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Arcades does the same thing but for things with defenders. Felithur the Steadfast. So if you're playing any of these commanders, the Walls of Ba Sing Se suddenly becomes literally one of the best cards in your entire deck. Like, if you're dealing damage equal to toughness rather than power, this is an 8-mana 30/30 that can almost do an Avacyn impression. So, same with like Assault Formation, Rolling Stone. There's a bunch of these weird cards that let you attack with walls and deal damage equal to their toughness. So, I think that's another way to play these cards. There's also some specific synergies that are funny. Maybe my favorite is Jaws of Defeat. It's this 4-mana enchantment that says, when a creature you control enters, target opponent loses life equal to the difference between that creature's power and its toughness. So if you have Jaws out and place a Walls of Bossing, say, an opponent is going to lose 30 life, which is the difference between the power and toughness. It's also obviously absurd with like Last March of the Ents, which draws equal to the greatest toughness of a creature you control, and then lets you put any number of creatures into play from your hand. So you draw 30 cards and then just dump a bunch of stuff into play. Even just Verdant Sun's Avatar, whenever another creature enters, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. So play Verdant Sun the next turn Walls, and then you gain 30 life. So those are the kind of synergies you're looking for with this card. As far as other commanders that would want this, basically anything that cares about high toughness or low power. So Phoenix, for example, lets you tap creatures to mill equal to their toughness. So Phoenix into Walls, you tap it to mill 30, you're going to mill the table out super quickly. Terra, another commander that can reanimate things with low power. Giralf lets you sack a non-token creature and make a XX blue zombie where X is a sacrifice creature's toughness. So you can sack the walls and make a 30/30. Baldin, another toughness matters commander. So any deck that's toughness matters, low power matters, anything like that, I think it's going to want Walls of Bossing, say. It also could just be good in colorless decks, right? Like, colorless decks ramp a lot. You can't play Avacyn, and this could just be a way to protect your colorless board. And I like this energy that if you make this indestructible, then it kind of turns into a hard lock. So the Walls of Bossing, say, most decks aren't going to want this card, but the fact that it has the highest toughness in literally all of Magic makes it a really interesting option for certain archetypes, and in those decks, it's going to be really powerful, and this might be one of the best against odds cards from the set. We also got a new Mythic Saga in the Legend of Kyoshi / Avatar Kyoshi. So the front side, the Saga side, 6-mana green Saga. First lore counter, draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Second lore counter, you Earthbend X, where X is the number of cards in your hand, and that land becomes an island in addition to its other types. That's just a flavor thing. And then third lore counter, you flip it around into Avatar Kyoshi, a 5/4 legendary avatar. This is lands you control have trample and hexproof, and you can tap it to add X mana of any one color, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So this card is interesting to me. If we start with the front side of this card, we essentially get a Rishkar's expertise. You lose the upside of maybe playing something for free, but you get the upside that eventually you're going to get Avatar Kyoshi, you get to Earthbend something and make a big creature, and we've seen these draw equal to power effects be some of the best card draw in Commander, especially in green decks, because green decks are so good at putting big creatures into play. So if you're playing a green Commander deck, I think this is in the running for one of your card draw slots, just based on that first lore counter. The Earthbending mode, we have nothing that does exactly what that does. The closest I could come up with was like Mordenkainen makes us token with power and toughness equal to twice the number of cards in your hand. There's a bit of a difference here. Well, first it's double, which is better than single. But the other difference is the dog's power and toughness changes based on how many cards are in your hand at a specific point in time. So you can make the dog, but then like empty your hand and the dog's going to shrink. The Legend of Kyoshi, it's going to be static because Earthbending puts the counters on when the ability happens. You can draw a bunch of cards with the first lore counter, Earthbend this massive land, and then if you empty your hand after that, the land's still going to remain massive, and also an island for some reason. So basically, a ton of card draw and a big body, which isn't bad. I think the question for this card is, there's a bunch of effects, and I'm thinking of this mostly as a commander card rather than a standard card, but we have a bunch of effects now, like Rishkar's expertise, that draw equal to the greatest power of creatures you control. We have Rishkar's expertise, we have Return of the Wild Speaker, we have Season of Gathering, we have Lifestream's Blessing, which is actually really good because you can foretell it. We have Garruk Primal Hunter. So I'm not sure if we've reached the point now where we have to start choosing which of these cards we put in our green commander decks. We might be at the point where there's just so many of this effect that we can't actually play all of them. I will say, I think the Legend of Kyoshi is a good version of this effect. I'm not sure that it's as good as the best version of the effect, which is probably Return to the Wild Speaker, just because you can cast it at instant speed, assuming you're not some sort of human deck. But I think it is in the top tier. Like, you get so much value out of this. I actually think it's pretty comparable to Rishkar's Expertise, which I believe is the second most played out of these cards, behind Return of the Wild Speaker. Yes, you don't get the free 5-drop the turn that you play it, but I think it makes up for that by eventually flipping to the backside and making the big Earthbend land. So I think this card is very good and something you can play in most green commander decks. Most green commander decks can have big creatures, and if you're playing a bunch of big creatures, this card is just very good in the deck. The backside of this card, Avatar Kyoshi, is interesting to me. So essentially you get a Savala Heart of the Wilds. You get this creature that can tap for potentially a huge amount of mana, and it does snowball with the front side of the card. You make this massive Earthbend land. Well, first you draw a ton of cards, and then you make a huge Earthbend land based on the number of cards that are in your hand, and then you flip an Avatar Kyoshi. If that lands a 10/10 or something, which seems kind of realistic, this just taps to make 10 mana of any one color, which is a huge burst of mana. It is slow ramped. You're probably not doing this until like turn 8 or something, but once it gets going, it makes a huge amount of mana. And then you also get just some upside if you're some sort of Earthbend deck. Like, giving your lands trample and hexproof without Earthbending doesn't really do a ton. It does work, again, with the Earthbend land on the front side. I guess hexproof means you can't get strip mined or whatever, but really it's supposed to work with Earthbend, where you have all of these lands that are creatures thanks to Earthbend, and then Avatar Kyoshi lets them trample over for damage and make sure your opponent can't kill them. So I think the backside is relatively powerful, and I like how it synergizes with the front side. As far as Standard's concerned, these cards just typically don't see play. We've had a lot of this effect printed recently. This like expensive 6-mana draw equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. We have Season of Growth in Standard right now, and it's just not the kind of card that people play. And the big problem is, in a format like Standard, you have a lot of decks that are killing all your things, right? And if your opponent just kills all your stuff and never lets you keep a big creature on the battlefield, then that first lore counter doesn't really do anything. But if this is going to work in Standard, I imagine it's going to be in some sort of ramp deck with big creatures like Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Lumbering Whirlwagon. These are cards that can ramp you into the Legend of Kyoshi and leave behind a big body that can then draw you a ton of cards with the Legend of Kyoshi. So I'm interested in trying in a ramp deck. Maybe the fact that it's a saga and you get these other modes and it eventually makes a big creature, maybe that's enough to make up for the fact that these cards typically aren't super standard playable. So I think this one has a better shot than most, although the fact that Season of Growth isn't really seeing play does give me some pause. It also could be good in just some sort of earthbending deck. If you're all about earthbending and you're getting extra combats with your Legend of Kyoshi Earthbend land with Boomy, or you're doing shenanigans with Baifeng's Bounty Hungers, or you have Badger Molekup, then I think this goes up in value as well. So I think those are the main homes for this card. As far as Commander is concerned, I think you can play this in basically just any green deck. Obviously, you gotta have big creatures. I'm sure there's some green decks out there that don't do that, but most green decks are gonna have big creatures. And then you just play this like a Rishkar's Expertise or Return to the Wild Speaker, draw a huge amount of cards, use those cards to win the game. It also is even better in a couple of specific places. So I think you'd play any green deck. It gets even better if you're an Earthbend deck, obviously. And then it's really cool in Saga decks, specifically Saga decks that can remove counters from your sagas. So like Sigurd or Garnet. These are commanders that let you remove your lore counters from your sagas. So what you can do is like play the Legend of Kyoshi, draw a huge amount of cards, and then use your commander to remove the lore counter, and then next turn you're going to draw a huge amount of cards again. Or you can let it go up to lore counter number 2 to get the big Earthbend land, and then remove a counter to put it back down to 1 lore counter, so the next turn you get the second lore counter and you Earthbend again to make another huge land. So if you have synergies to let you remove counters from sagas, then this card becomes even more wild. So the Legend of Kyoshi / Avatar Kyoshi, probably mostly a commander card, but it is a very powerful one and a super sweet design. We also got our blue Ascension in Waterbender Ascension. So Waterbender Ascension, 2-mana blue enchantment. It says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put a quest counter on this enchantment. Then if it has 4 more quest counters on it, draw a card, and then you can Waterbend 4 to make target creature unblockable for the turn. So Waterbend, just because I've seen some confusion on this, you can pay a Waterbend cost with mana, or by tapping artifacts, or by tapping creatures, or any combination of that. So if you want to play Waterbend 4, you could like tap 1 mana, 1 creature, and 2 artifacts. Or you could tap 4 mana and 0 creatures and 0 artifacts. Or 4 artifacts, 0 creatures, 0 mana. So any combination of those works. So Waterbender Ascension It's essentially a coastal piracy or a Biden Nathasa, I guess, enduring curiosity in enchantment mode, mixed with a rogue's passage, and these are some effects that are very playable in Commander. When I think about Commander in blue card draw, Biden Nathasa in Coastal Piracy are some of the best card draw effects that you can play in creature-heavy blue decks, and Rogue's Passage is a staple for getting through damage, and a Rogue's Passage you can waterbend out the unblockability. It's a nice upside because you can tap your artifacts and your creatures instead of having to pay mana for it. So I think that Waterbender Ascension seems like a Commander staple. If you compare it to something like Biden Nathasa or Coastal Piracy, it's actually kind of interesting. So they are 4 mana, but they just are turned on right away. Whenever a creature deals combat damage, you draw a card. Waterbender Ascension cuts the mana in half, down to 2 mana, which is huge, but you essentially miss out on your first 3 card draws, because the first 3 times creatures deal damage, you just add counters, but you don't get to draw the card. So it's a Coastal Piracy or Biden Nathasa that comes down earlier, but draws you less cards. Once you get it turned on, they do exactly the same thing, but with the upside that you can make things unblockable. But I still think if your deck that's playing Biden Nathasa or Coastal Piracy, you now play Waterbender Ascension either instead or along, most likely, with something like Biden Nathasa. As far as Standard's concerned, it's hard for me to see this beating out Enduring Curiosity. Enduring Curiosity is just a ridiculous card. I mean, it's got flash, it's got a reasonable body, you gotta kill it twice. So I think if you want this effect in Standard, you just stick with Enduring Curiosity. The one exception to this might be if it ends up getting banned on Monday, which isn't impossible. I think Dimir is like in the next tier of decks beyond Izzet Cauldron and maybe Mono Red that could be targeted with bannings. If there's a fear that Dimir's just going to end up the next Izzet Cauldron or the next Izzet Cutter once we have the banning. So there is some chance that something like Enduring Curiosity get banned. If that happened, then Waterbend Ascension would be a little bit more appealing just because you wouldn't have another better option like that in the format. If this card was going to work in Standard, and again, I think you just play Enduring Curiosity, but it could be sweet in some sort of like low to the ground evasion token deck. Like we had the Convoke decks a few months ago or last season in Standard. They haven't been as popular since we've had rotation, but if you're playing a Warden of the Inner Sky, Spyglass Siren, going wide with Resolute Reinforcements, you can turn this on pretty quickly, and then once it's turned on, it is a really powerful effect, and then you chip in for a bunch of damage, and then eventually get your opponent low enough, and you can just tap some creatures to make your biggest thing unblockable, and swing in and close out the game with 1 attack. So I could see the upside of playing it in the right deck in Standard. I think it's also cute, and this is so funny, but the Waterbender Ascension actually might be at its best in a firebending deck in Standard, because in a firebending deck, assuming you're in blue, the card draw is nice, but that waterbend mode becomes very powerful because you can activate it during combat with your firebending mana to make your firebending creatures unblockable so they're not going to trade off during combat. So if something like Azula or Firelord Azula end up being playable and we have like a Grixis firebending deck, I could actually see Waterbender Ascension being at its best in that deck, even though flavor-wise, it is very weird. As far as Commander is concerned, the card's just straight up great. As I said before, if you're playing Biden Nathasa, if you're playing Coastal Piracy, you play this alongside those cards or instead of those cards. So any go-wide blue deck, a Layla, Zinnia, Edric, very, very strong there. And then I'm also intrigued by the Rogue's Passage mode on this card. Like Rogue's Passage itself, it doesn't say creature you control. So you can use this like a political tool, and a huge upside compared to Rogue's Passage is you can activate this multiple times in a turn. So if you're some sort of like go wide with clue token deck like Lonus or Morska, or some treasure deck like Admiral Beckett Bass, or a food deck like the Goose Mother, if you can just build up a ton of these trinkets, Waterbender Ascension becomes a very scary way to force through damage, either with your own creatures, or you can always help out one of your opponents who's attacking the archenemy by making their creatures unblockable to deal with a problem that you both have. So I think Waterbender Ascension in Standard probably just not as good as Enduring Curiosity, but in Commander this card is super legit and I think is going to be a staple in a lot of blue decks. We also got a new ally in South Pole Voyager, a 2-mana 2/2 human scout ally. It says when this creature and other ally that you control enters, you gain a life. If it's the second time this ability is resolved this turn, you draw a card. So I gotta say South Pole Voyager Voyager. I really like that this sort of calls back to the old allies that trigger when an ally enters. Not as powerful as old allies, but still, it is nice to see that callback. So what is this card? It's essentially like a Soul Warden effect for allies, mixed with, I guess, Rumor Gatherer, where if you can trigger it at least twice in a turn, you get to draw a card. When you add that together on a 2/2 body, that's actually a pretty powerful effect. I think if you're playing an ally deck, this is probably going to be part of it. As far as life gaining goes, it is way worse than Undo Cleric. Like, Undo Cleric, it doesn't look like much, but the fact that when an ally enters, you gain life equal to the number of allies you control means that this card can actually get out of hand super quick in an ally deck, where you play a single, like, 1-mana ally, and you gain, like, 10 life, because you got a bunch of allies on the battlefield. But I think I would just play South Pole Voyager alongside Undo Cleric, plus the card draw is a nice bonus. So if you're playing an ally deck, in Standard, or definitely in Commander, I think South Pole Voyager is just a super easy inclusion. It really doesn't matter what kind of allies you are. You're going to be playing a bunch of allies. This is going to be drawing you cards. It's going to be gaining life. It's just a very, very solid ally. We also got a couple of new rare lands, starting with Agna Qel'a, which is apparently the waterbending city's actual name, I guess. I don't even know if they ever said that in the show that I remember, but anyway, it's a blue land in the cycle. It enters tapped unless you have a basic. It taps to hit a blue mana, and then you can pay 3 mana, including a blue, and tap it to draw a card and discard a card. So this is essentially mono blue Desolate Lighthouse, an upgraded Desolate Lighthouse in a lot of ways. Also, Avishkar's Raceway, except you don't gotta get to max speed to use it, and it makes colored mana, and I think this card's actually very solid. If you can make this come into play untapped, I think this is worth playing pretty much across archetypes. Like, if you're playing blue-white control and you got a bunch of basic lands, I think the card's great. You can just use it, leave up your mana during your opponent's turn. If you don't need to counter something or whatever, then you can loot, get rid of an extra land, fill your graveyard, go digging for what you do need. Maybe you're playing some sort of mono blue flash deck. Then this card's kind of just a free roll, right? If you're playing 18 islands and 4 of these in your mana base, it's just always going to come into play untapped. And sure, it doesn't serve any specific purpose, but if you run out of action, you got some extra mana, you can loot and try to find some action. I can even see Dimir maybe playing it, although their mana base isn't usually super basic heavy. I will say, if this comes into play tapped often in your deck, then it becomes much less appealing. Like, yeah, the effect's still fine, but much less good if it's not making mana right away. There are some additional synergies, too, for this card. So we were just talking about playing this as a generic, like, looting effect, but if you're playing a graveyard deck, maybe you're trying to reanimate things with Zombify or set up Superior Spider-Man, then this card's even better, right? You just loot away your Velgavoth and then Zombify it. Loot away your Bringer of the Last Dead and then Superior Spider-Man it. Also pretty cute with decks that care about discarding. A Monument to Endurance, Captain Howler, all the Mayhem decks like Fleam. This is kind of a Fleam staple, although I think Fleam exemplifies the tension of this card. It would be great with Fleam, right? Like, Fleam is a deck that just cares about discarding cards and filling your graveyard, but in a 3-color deck, is it going to be worth it? Are you going to have enough basics? I think the design of these lands, and I love that they did this, is really to push them towards monocolor decks. You obviously can play them outside of monocolor decks, but they're going to be at their best in monocolor decks, which you're going to have a ton of basics. I think they're also very good in 2-color decks. Once you start to get to 3 colors, and definitely 4 and 5 colors, that's where I'm like, like, in those decks, I need way more dual lands. I'm not going to have as many basic lands. If this is coming to play untapped and only making 1 color, do I even want it? So I think that's a nice tension with this card, where the more colors you have, the worse it gets, but it's still powerful enough that I could see some 3-color decks wanting this card. As far as older formats, it wasn't that long ago that Desolate Lighthouse was a legit card people played in Modern. I guess maybe it was kind of a while ago now, but several to many years ago now. And I think that this is just an upgraded version. The problem is, I don't know what deck would want this. I envision some sort of like mono blue control deck, mono blue turns deck, and these are archetypes that don't really exist in Modern or Pioneer right now. But if something like that emerges, then I could see this being a nice option just to filter through your deck. In Commander, there's a couple of comparisons here. Castle Vantress is kind of a staple in blue decks, and it's pay 4 and tap to scry 2. If people are playing Castle Vantress in their blue decks, I think you play this too, or even instead. And in mono blue, you should have more than enough room to play both of these cards. Another comparison, War Room, which in a monocolor deck is pay 3 tap and lose a life to draw a card. I think that War Room's probably better in mono blue, but still, why not just play both of them? If you're playing 20, 22, 23 islands in your deck, I'm pretty sure you got enough room that you can cut one of them and play this, and it's just going to add a little extra utility to your mana base. So I think this is a card that, if you're mono blue, you just play every time. I don't really care what you're doing with mono blue. You could be Urza Artifacts, you could be Talryn Spellslinger, you could be Ovar, whatever Ovar's doing. You could be Elug mono blue shenanigans. I think you just play this as a looting effect for value, and then it goes up in value even more, assuming you care about filling your graveyard, like Hashitan, for example. When you discard a creature card, you can pay 3 and make a copy of it, essentially, that's a zombie. This works great there, right? This is another way that you can discard a card, or like, it's a way to fill your graveyard for Madrotha, or Sidisi, or Rafine, or Trigger Captain Howler, or do Fleam Norman Osborn things. So again, once you get to 3 colors, that's where I'm like, eh. And I think the other consideration here, when you get to the 3 color decks, is how many fetch lands are you playing? Because if you're playing a fully powered non-budget fetch land mana base where your 3 color deck is playing 9 fetch lands, then I think you can still have this come into play untapped very easily, because you can just fetch out a basic at some point early in the game, and then this will come into play untapped for the rest of the game. So in 3 color decks with expensive mana bases, I think this card is still very good. On the other hand, if you're a 3 color non-fetch land deck and you need to play a bunch of like tri-lands and like lower tier dual lands, then it becomes a little bit sketchy, because you're already going to have more tap lands, and this is going to come into play tapped a reasonable amount of the time, but it is very good in any deck trying to fill the graveyard. So Agna Qel'a seems like a pretty sweet card. This whole cycle seems really strong, and I really like that they're trying to support monocolor decks, which is something we could use more of. We also got the green member of this cycle in Ba Sing Se, not the walls, the city itself, and this is the green member of the cycle. Enters tapped and lets you have a basic, it makes a green, and then you can pay 3 and tap it to Earthbend 2, but only as a sorcery. So target land you control becomes a 0/0 creature with haste. It's still land, put 2+1/+1 counters on it. When it dies or goes to exile, you return it to play tapped. Worth mentioning that if you want to attack with that land, you actually are going to need 5 mana open, because you're going to need 3 to activate Ba Sing Se, 1 to tap Ba Sing Se itself, and then another land that's untapped to Earthbend onto. So it is worth keeping in mind that it is kind of expensive, and one of the sneaky downsides of Earthbend is if you animate too many of your lands and are attacking with them, you're not going to have them to make mana with, which is not a deal breaker. It's still a very powerful mechanic, but it is something to keep in mind with how the mechanic actually plays. So Ba Sing Se, I really like that this calls back to some super old Magic cards. If you go back to like the early 90s, green had this theme of turning your lands into 2/2 creatures permanently on like Verdant Touch or Quirion Dryad. And Ba Sing Se is along those lines. You're essentially turning a land into a 2/2 creature. Yeah, you're doing it with +1/+1 counters and get the upside that if it dies, you get it back. But it is very similar to these old cards. We've also seen some other similar lands that make 2/2 creatures. So like Argoth's Sanctum of Nature, Secluded Starforge. If you go back a ways, Urza's Factory. These are all lands that you can just tap and pay an amount of mana and you get a 2/2 creature. Very similar to Ba Sing Se. Ba Sing Se, you get the upside that it is the cheapest of these effects. It's only 3 and tap to Earthbend 2, but you get the downside that, like I said before, you are turning your lands into creatures, which means you might not be using them as lands because you want to use them for attacking rather than for making mana, but still kind of calls back to these cards. And I think a land that just repeatedly adds bodies to the battlefield, or remember, you can also just Earthbend onto the same land, right? You can Earthbend on a land, make it a 2/2, and the next turn, rather than turning on another land, you can make that land a 4/4 by adding 2 more counters, and a 6/6 by adding 2 more counters. So you can just keep stacking up on that one land, but I think that's a pretty powerful effect. This is another card that does some strip mine locky stuff, almost like Wrenn 6 once you get back to Timeless. Because of how Earthbend works, returning the land to play tapped once the land goes to the graveyard, you can like use Ba Sing Se to Earthbend a strip mine, then strip mine one of your opponent's lands, and then because of Earthbend, the strip mines are going to come back into play tapped. So then the next turn, you can Earthbend the strip mine, blow up another one of your opponent's lands, get it back. Not as good as Wrenn 6, because Wrenn 6 just does this for 2 mana, and Ba Sing Se is essentially 4 mana, actually kind of 5 mana to do this because you need the strip mine untapped. But still, it is another way that you can potentially just lock your opponent out of the game with strip mine and wasteland. It also can loop Urza's Saga, which is kind of nice by Earthbending it. So if you have any lands that want to sacrifice themselves, this is pretty nice value because of the way you can keep getting those lands back and reusing their abilities. As far as what we do with this card, I would play this in any mono green deck in Standard. I think you throw this in alongside Soulstone Sanctuary in something like our Hemosymbiotic Might, Frenzied Baloth mono green aggro deck, and you have a ton of protection against Wrath and removal. You try to get in for damage with your Mights and your Baloths early in the game, and if your opponent finds the Day of Judgment or whatever to Wrath away your board, then you trust that Ba Sing Se and Soulstone Sanctuary are going to be able to close out the game post-Wrath and fight through that removal. Plus, turning lands into creatures is nice because some removal doesn't hit lands anyway, so it's a way you can get through even more damage. I also think it's good in any, like, 2-color green-based deck with a bunch of creatures, like Tifa Lakar, Aboroid Simic decks. I think you play this in those decks as well, for the same reason. Like, you have your primary plan of Tifa Lakar landfall or Aboroid counters, and then if that goes wrong, you just got this land that can repeatedly pump out 2/2 hasters, essentially, to close out the game. There's also some +1/+1 counter synergies. We haven't seen decks like this really take off in Standard, but if you're playing Hollowmurk Siege or Innkeeper's Talon or Dryadrine, then Ba Sing Se gets even better because it makes creatures with counters to draw you cards. It benefits from Innkeeper's Talent. If you have like Hardened Scale shenanigans, you get even more counters on the land. So it goes up in value in counter decks as well. In Commander, play it in every green deck. Like, just play it in every green deck. It's basically a free roll. Why not? Like, you're not going to use it super often, but there are going to be situations where being able to Earthbend a land too is really important. And in mono green, it's always going to come into play on tap, so there really shouldn't be any harm there. It also is very cute in Earthbend decks, obviously, that just care about Earthbending, but other land sack style decks, like the Gitrog Monster is always sacrificing lands. You got Hazazon, which cares about deserts going in and out of the graveyard. You got Lord Windgrace, which gets lands back from the graveyard. So if you're playing land sack shenanigans and landfall shenanigans, then this goes up in value as well because of the Earthbending the land coming back into play trick. You can like Earthbend a land and then sack that land to the Gitrog Monster, and then you get that land back anyway. So you get around the downside of having sack a land, and you get to draw your cards and do all your synergy stuff. So Ba Sing Se, really good. This whole cycle just seems really good, pretty pushed, and should be playable in Standard, and definitely back in Commander decks as well. Same situation as other lands, where it's really about how many colors are in your deck. If you're 5-color, 4-color, especially without playing super expensive fetch land mana bases, then you probably don't want this card. But if you're monocolor, the card's insane, and even 2- and 3-color decks, depending on your mana base, it can still be very good. Next up, we get an intriguing new black enchantment in Obsessive Pursuit, a 2-mana black enchantment. It says when this enchantment enters, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life and create a clue token, and then whenever you attack, put X +1/+1 counters on target attacking creature, where X is the number of permanents you sack this turn. If X is 3 or more, that creature gains lifelink until end of turn. So Obsessive Pursuit, I don't really know what to think of this card. It's kind of like a Phyrexian Arena, but it makes a clue, so you got to spend mana to actually draw the card. It's kind of like a Bitter Blossom, but rather than getting a creature token, you get a clue token. And then, if you really want to stretch it, and this actually in a weird way might be the best comparison, it's kind of like a Prophyletic Memory, but for sacking things rather than drawing cards, as a 2-mana enchantment that can grow a creature equal to the number of things that you did. In Prophyletic Memory case, it's draw cards, but with Obsessive Pursuit, it's sacrifice stuff, and getting lifelink is a nice bonus there as well. I think we're looking at a bunch of very powerful cards, so even if Obsessive Pursuit isn't exactly any one of these, considering that those are probably the closest comparisons, I think this card actually has a chance to be pretty good. So what do we actually do with this card? Well, thought number one is some sort of sacrifice deck. Like, imagine you're playing, food token producers like Unlucky Cabbage Merchant, and you're playing Obsessive Pursuit, which is making clues, and then maybe an Umbro Collar Zealot, so you can sacrifice your artifacts to surveil. I could see just building up a bunch of trinkets and then, like, sacrificing them to Umbro Collar Zealot, putting all the counters on some evasive creature like Deep Cavern Bat, and just getting in for a huge amount of damage to close out the game. So that's one possibility. It also could be cute in Sephiroth-style decks. In a Sephiroth-style deck, you're not really taking advantage of the clue super specifically. However, you can sack a lot of things, and be able to sack a bunch of things and then get a bunch of counters, and lifelink actually seems pretty powerful there as well. You could even play this as a full-on combo card with stuff like Pitiless Carnage, which just lets you sack any number of your permanents and draw that many cards. So you just make a bunch of permanents, have something like a Ginger Brute that can be unblockable, and then just sack everything, including your lands, go to combat, put all the counters on the Ginger Brute, cross your fingers that it's going to work out and there's not a removal spell, and maybe win the game with one attack. There's also some synergies with firebending. So one of the cool tricks with this card, because it is a firebending card, right? It doesn't say firebending, but the characters on it, the theme of it is pretty firebending. But what you can do is you can make some clue tokens with Obsessive Pursuit, and then you can go to combat and attack, and with the put a bunch of counters on something trigger on the stack, you can use your firebending mana, have that resolve first, crack a bunch of clues, and then put a bunch of counters on something. There is even like a small sub-theme of sacrifice in the firebending mechanic. We say that like Zhao cares about things being sacrificed. There's an uncommon Azula, which makes clue tokens when it attacks, so maybe there's some synergy there too. It also could be a combo piece. If your combo involves sacrificing things infinitely, like we were talking about this Baifeng's Bounty Hunter Bloodghast Umbral Collar Zealot combo, which essentially allows you to sack Bloodghast an infinite amount of times, then you end up making an infinitely big creature with Obsessive Pursuit when you go to combat, put those counters on some sort of trampler or flyer or unblockable creature, and probably just win the game. So it can kind of be a payoff for some infinite combos. In older formats, I'm not imagining this to actually be like a busted modern card, but there are some modern and pioneer decks that sack a lot of things. Think of like Asmo decks and how many foods they sacrifice. Think about Cauldron Familiar decks and the loops that they do. It even just triggers based on cracking a fetch land. You're able to get a +1/+1 counter onto that. And it's only 2 mana. So again, I don't expect this to like be some busted modern card, but I could imagine homes for this card in older formats. Once you get back to Commander, the story is kind of similar. So if you have infinite sack loops like Gravecrawler loops, Obsessive Pursuit is just kind of a wild finisher. It just gives you an infinitely powerful creature when you go to combat to win the game. And I think this is good in basically any sack deck. Like if you're playing Korvold or Igra or Carmen or Camella, Chatterfang or Merrick or Hearthol, something that's just sacrificing a lot, then I think Obsessive Pursuit is very, very good. It's probably even at its best in a deck like Korvold, because if you're a deck that can care about sacrificing artifacts or permanents rather than specifically creatures, then you can take even more advantage of the clue. Even if you don't want to spend 2 mana to crack the clue, you can always sacrifice it to your Korvold or whatever, which is going to be another thing sacrificed for Obsessive Pursuit, which will be even more counters once you go to combat, and then you probably just Voltron one-shot kill people with your commander. So I imagine the card's really good in those sack decks, and it's also good in clue decks. There's not a ton of black-based clue decks, but there's a few: Inquisitor Greyfax, Tisa Opulent Oligarch, Lazav, if you just care about having clues on the battlefield, because you can take advantage of them in some way that isn't just paying 2 mana to sack them. Obsessive Pursuit gives you one every single turn. So Obsessive Pursuit, I really like this card. It's efficient, it's unique, it does a bunch of little things. It can be aggressive, it can be more controlling as a card advantage engine. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with it, but I do think this card has potential to be very playable. We also got our official exclusive MTG Goldfish preview card from the set. Thanks to Wizards for hooking us up in Great Divide Guide. And this card is kind of wild. It's a 2-mana 2/3 human scout ally. It's a green card. It says each land and each ally you control has tap to add 1 mana of any color. So Great Divide Guide, this card is actually very push. So 2/3 stats, already very good. Like, its floor is, it's a 2-mana 2/3 mana dork, because it's an ally, so you can tap it to make a mana. So it's a 2-mana mana dork with a relatively good body, but it does so much more than that. If you want to think about what this card actually is, it's essentially Joiner Adept with better stats, which Joiner Adept, not a very powerful card. Like, letting all your lands tap for any color, I guess it's kind of like a Chromatic Lantern. It does have the upside that it lets you turn off your brain and you don't have to think about, especially in 5-color decks, am I tapping properly? Because all your lands just tap for everything. But it's not the most powerful effect. What is incredibly powerful is this is essentially a Gemhide Sliver for the ally tribe. And ah, man, Gemhide Sliver is a really powerful card. Letting all of your allies tap for any color of mana is going to greatly change the way the allies play. I think this is one of the most important allies that has ever been printed as far as making the deck actually strong in basically any format. Because right now, allies are missing the mana production. You usually get Harbaz Druid, the one big mana producer for allies, which just taps to add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of allies you control. But this is way, way better than that. It's literally Gemhide Sliver with better stats, but for allies, and that's going to do some bonkers things. For example, Allies are really good with going wide with tokens, right? We got United Front, we got Soka, we got Gather the White Lotus. So allies are all about just adding a bunch of allies to the battlefield. And what I'm envisioning is you start making allies, and then you can use cards like Akum Battleslinger to make sure all your allies have haste, Chasm Guide to make sure that all your allies have haste. And then you just can tap all the tokens that you're making to make more mana, which lets you cast more allies, which will then get haste and tap for more mana. And next thing you know, if you throw in some card draw, you can use this to just kind of play through your deck and have these huge explosive turns. I don't know if you've ever played against Slivers and seen what Slivers can do once a Gemhide Sliver comes down and just like how big of a turn they can have. Now allies can do that too, thanks to Great Divide Guide. I think this card is potentially standard playable, like if there is a standard ally deck, and I think we might have enough pieces to make a standard ally deck. Just looking at Earth Kingdom Protectors, into Earth King's Lieutenant, into Katira, into Aang, I think that this would have a home there as well. And standard being a 2-3 is actually kind of a big deal. Don't forget, unlike Gemhide Sliver, this isn't some super weak 1/1. It's actually a fine body on the battlefield, and it makes mana itself, and it allows for those big explosive combo turns. But as I mentioned before, the thing I'm so excited about for this card is I have always found, playing Slivers in Commander, that Gemhide Sliver and Mana Weft Sliver are the most important slivers in the deck. I think if you ask a Sliver player, what sliver do you want to see the most in your opening hand? I think a lot of Sliver players would name one of these mana slivers, and Great Divine Guide is the same thing, but in a lot of ways even better because it's got better stats, but for allies. So if you're playing allies in Commander, this is just the first card you add to your deck. I don't care if you're playing Suki or Avatar Aang or Tazri or General Tazri. It doesn't matter as long as you're in green. You play this every single time, and you pray really hard to the magic gods that you have in your opening hand, because the games that you have access to this, you are going to do some incredibly explosive, super powerful things. So Great Divide Guide, I think this card is actually super great. Obviously, you gotta be an ally deck to play this card. I don't think otherwise you would want to play it, but in an ally deck, not only is this card good, I actually think it is legitimately great, and it's gonna be one of the most important allies in Commander, and probably good in standard allies as well, assuming standard allies is even a thing. Rounding things out today, there's one lower rarity card I want to mention, in Joo Dee, One of Many, a 2-mana 2/2 human advisor. It has an ability where you can pay 1 black mana, tap it, and surveil 1, and create a token that's a copy of this creature, and then sack an artifact or creature, only do it as a sorcery. So Joo Dee, this card is interesting. It kind of reminds me of Mere Propagator, a creature that can make more copies of itself. Obviously, Joo Dee has the issue that you have to sacrifice something, so that's an extra hoop you gotta jump through, but there's ways around that. Imagine you're playing a sacrifice deck, then maybe just sacrificing something is an upside because it's triggering your Sephiroth, it's triggering your Vengeful Blood Witch, plus the Surveil like fills your graveyard for Raise the Past or Froggy Swamp Visions. So I think I can see playing this in a sacrifice deck. It also seems good in decks that have a lot of trinket tokens, the clue tokens and map tokens, because that's the easiest way to just really snowball off with this card. You can pay 1, tap it, and make another Grizzly Bear, another Joo Dee, and then sack a clue or sack a map rather than having to sack a creature, and then you can just try to build up this big board of Joo Dees and use it to win the game. It's also kind of wild with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with the bannings. Do they ban Soul Cauldron? It's definitely possible, but if Soul Cauldron still exists when Joo Dee comes out, you can do some crazy things with this, because if you get exiled under an Agatha's Soul Cauldron, then all of your creatures will have play a mana, tap it, make a token that's a copy of it, sack an artifact or creature. So if you have, let's say, a Vaultborn Tyrant, you can tap your Vaultborn Tyrant to make another Vaultborn Tyrant, and then sacrifice the Vaultborn Tyrant, and you gain a ton of life, and you draw a ton of cards. I know Agatha's Soul Cauldron, we broke it, it always does broken things, but it is really cute with Joo Dee. So Joo Dee, I'm not saying this card's like broken or a staple or anything, but it's a super interesting design, and I can't imagine decks and scenarios where it actually can be kind of powerful too. We get a few more cards from the source material sheet, which I know everyone just loves the source material cards. Nothing really big to see here. I guess the Zula Flame of Ember Island, technically Daikon's like a $20 card, although that's mostly due to lack of supply from being from Portal originally, rather than the card being actually all that playable. Insurrection, I guess, Commander playable, kind of brutal. I don't really play it myself because it's kind of easy mode, but it is a powerful way to win a game if people build up a big board. Otherwise, a bit of draft chat that you can check out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Avatar spoilers for today. So, what do you think of the biggest butted creature in Magic? What about the new rare lands? All the other stuff? Let me know in the comments. And I'll be back tomorrow with even more Avatar spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular day, everyone. And I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic Queen? Find yesterday's spoiler video here. Or maybe check out the video about the deck that literally poured pros to death at the Pro Tour.